This morning, our scripture reading is going to come from the Old Testament book of Exodus, and we'll begin reading in the 18th chapter, the 5th verse. Exodus 18, beginning in verse 5. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought Moses' son and wife back to him in the desert where he had set up camp at God's mountain. He sent word to Moses, "I, your father-in-law Jethro, am coming to you along with your wife and her 2 sons." Moses went out to meet his father-in-law, and he bowed down and kissed him. They asked each other how they were doing, and then they went into the tent. Moses then told his father-in-law everything that the Lord had done to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians on Israel's behalf, and all the difficulty they had on their journey, and how the Lord had rescued them. The next day, Moses sat as a judge for the people, while the people stood around Moses from morning until evening. When Moses' father-in-law saw that all that he was doing for the people, he said, "What's this that you're doing for the people? Why do you sit alone while all the people are standing around you from morning until evening?" And Moses said to his father-in-law, "Because the people come to me to inquire of God. When a conflict arises between them, they come to me, and I judge between the 2 of them. I also teach them God's regulations and instructions." Moses' father-in-law said to him, "What you are doing isn't good. You will end up totally wearing yourself out, both you and these people who are with you. The work is too difficult for you. You can't do it alone." This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Well, as you have seen, we're doing this change-up thing where different preachers are preaching in different services. And so last week, John Sweeney was in here and talked to you about Barnabas. And these are all the people that we're talking about this July are all people who are lesser-known characters in the Bible. And they're still known characters. I mean, we're not going to try to see how lesser known we can get. I mean, we're not going that far. I mean, none of us are going to be preaching about Ahian. Ahian appears in 1 Chronicles in the tribal genealogies. He is a descendant of Manasseh. And so that listing where it says that Ahian existed, that is the only time Ahian is listed in the Bible. We know nothing else about him. So if you want to count this as the only sermon you'll probably ever hear on Ahian, feel free, because you'll never probably hear anyone else talk about him. But let's give him credit, though. I mean, he's only listed one time. He only makes it on one list, but he makes the Bible. I mean, that's a pretty good gig if you make the Bible. And so, I mean, I liked it. But we're talking about other folks. Barnabas last week, who is in the book, The Acts of the Apostles in the New Testament. We'll have Kelly will be sharing in-depth information about Lydia, the seller of purple, who basically appears for like half a second in the Acts of the Apostles, but she plays an important role because she opens up her home to the community, and she is a key player there. And then we'll go back in the Old Testament again, and Sherry Harris will be preaching on Deborah, who is the only female judge of the Israelite people once they established themselves in the land. And Deborah has she has a lot of attitude, and it makes me a little nervous that Sherry's really excited about preaching on Deborah. But she'll be here to share that. Well, today I'm talking about this other lesser-known person. From Exodus, we get the story of this person named Jethro. Now, before you get too excited, this is not a sermon based off of this Jethro. I mean, Jethro Bodine, portrayed by Max Baer Jr., the only surviving member of the Beverly Hillbillies cast. I mean, it'd be great to talk about this Jethro. After all, he was a double-knot spy. He had a 6th grade education, and he could cipher. We call it math. Basic math, but he could cipher, and there's a lot to talk about with this Jethro, but we won't. Instead, we're going to talk about this other Jethro, Jethro, the father-in-law of Moses. And we encounter him actually earlier in the book. He's not like Ahian, only appearing one time, one list. No, Jethro appeared earlier in the book of Exodus. We see him as a priest in the land of Midian. And Moses has to flee Egypt because you remember Moses, who was raised in the home of Pharaoh, even though he was Hebrew, he was a Jewish person by birth, raised in Pharaoh's house. One day he got so angry when he saw an Egyptian overseer being cruel to those who were making bricks to help build things in Egypt. So cruel to him that he strikes him, and Moses strikes the Egyptian overseer, and he dies. Well, Moses flees the land of Egypt because he doesn't know what will happen to him, and he goes to the land of Midian, and there he encounters Jethro, who welcomes him in. And Moses ends up marrying Jethro's daughter, Zipporah, and then he wants to help Jethro out, and so he goes out to help Jethro by helping him take care of his sheep. And the scripture tells us that one day he is tending the flock of his father-in-law Jethro on the side of a hill when suddenly, for the first time, he encounters God. He encounters Yahweh, the great I Am, a burning bush. And God speaks to him and gives him the purpose for his life. That Moses needs to go back to Egypt and needs to gather up God's people and take them to the promised land. And God would be with them. When we get to our reading today, that stuff has happened. Moses has gone back to Egypt, and he met his brother Aaron there, and together they began working to try to get Pharaoh to let God's people go. And there had been plagues sent to the land, and the Passover has been established, and now they have crossed through the Red Sea, and they are beginning their journey toward the Promised Land. And every morning when they walk out of their tents, there is this substance on the ground, and it's called manna. Literally, it's called, in Hebrew, manna, which means, what is it? Because the first time you walk out of your tent and see the ground cover, you go, what is it? And that's the name that stuck. Every morning, what is it's on the ground? In the evening, quail fly through for them to have protein in their diet. God is even providing water. By the time we encounter Moses and Jethro in this story, the Israelite people have faced their first opponents. They've gone to battle against the Amalek people, and it was a hard battle. Moses stood up on the hillside, and when he raised his staff and his arm toward God, giving God praise over the battle that's going before them and the winning that the Israelite people are winning, then they kept winning. And whenever he would lower his arms, they would start losing. Because there's only so long you can hold a stick in your arm in the air, and so finally he is worn out. They bring a rock, and he sits down on the rock, and then Aaron, his brother, holds up one hand, and another gentleman from the Israelites, holds the other arm up. And as long as his arms are up, they win. So they win the battle. Now Jethro shows up. Jethro shows up and brings Zipporah and the boys so that they can join with Moses on the journey. And Jethro sees Moses engaged in a different kind of battle now. He's engaged in a different battle, and despite his previous experience where he found out that he couldn't do it on his own because he needed someone to help hold his arms up, even though he had just experienced that, he's doing all of this by himself. People are coming to him with their problems, and Moses is spending all day long listening to them, morning until evening listening to them. So Jethro tells him, what you're doing isn't good. You're going to end up wearing yourself out. You're going to wear all these people out. The work's too difficult. You can't do it alone. I mean, let's be honest. How many of us at times need a visit from Jethro, who looks at us and says, what you're doing isn't good. You're going to wear yourself out. You're going to wear out the people with you. It's hard. You can't do it alone. You know, we live in a world where in too many places, in too many ways, there's too much stress in our lives. There are strained relationships. There's too little sleep. There's too much television. There are financial setbacks. There's struggles at school and at work. There are texts and emails and phone calls that just seem to never stop. We have fears in our life that cause stress. Fears over real things like COVID or cancer. And then we have misunderstandings between loved ones, and we have materialism that drives us and is the deciding factor sometimes in what we do and why we do it. We can be too busy and still not get it all done. We're divided by dozens of opinions, and we're running as hard as we can to keep up with others, and we're still going to bed with more left on our to-do list than we can possibly get to done. And there's this gap. There's this gap between our ought-tos and our can't-dos. And when our can-do can't keep up with our want-to, well, then frustration and tension and stress sets in. In so many ways, stress has become sort of the rule of life and not the exception to the rule. Jethro arrives and he finds Moses stressed out. You remember Moses' purpose in his life that he heard from God at the burning bush was to lead his people back to the promised land. Jethro arrives and Moses is stressed out because Moses is spending his whole time, all day long, listening to the problems of the people. Not leading, but just sitting and being bogged down with this. If you read Moses' story, you find that there are times when he is burned out and he's stressed out, and his father-in-law is trying to help him understand some simple rules for living. He's trying to get Moses to understand to do only what you can do. Delegate the rest to others and leave the results to God. Moses was called to lead the people to the promised land. That was what he could do, and that's what he had to do. But that's not what he was doing. Moses earned his stress. Honestly earned his stress. Sometimes if we're honest here with us, we're not going to ask for that show of hands on this one, but a lot of times our stress comes in our life because of procrastination. We put something off so long that it could have been easily done, but we put it off and delay it so long that now it's just a problem. And now it's stressful. Moses isn't like that. Moses is not procrastinating. He is not lazy. He's one of those guys, and in our day, we would say he gets to the office before sunup, and he goes home after sundown. He works 6 days a week. There's no vacation. There's no time off. He is a classic workaholic with his fuel tank on empty, and he's reached his limits. But he doesn't see it. How many of us actually see it when we reach our limits? We usually don't. In the 19th century, the shipping industry was having a difficult time. The world had seemed to expand overnight, and there was so much need for trade that England, who was producing a lot of materials and shipping them all over the world, they were seeing too many of their boats sink. And sometimes they would sink in massive storms that would come against the boat, and sometimes they said it was almost like a wake of a boat hit it. The smallest of waves would hit it, and suddenly it would just go down. And so in 1880, a man named Samuel Plimsoll, he went to Parliament with a solution. And his solution was to study each kind of ship, and then to go around the hull of the ship and to draw a line. And when you loaded the ship with supplies and trade goods and all of that, as the ship got heavier and the line went down, as soon as that line touched the water, you put nothing else on the ship. Nothing. Because that was the line that would allow it to sail and to keep going smoothly to wherever it needed to go. And they called it the Plimsoll line. How much you could take, you can't take any more. We all have one of those, don't we? Now, it's not drawn around our hull, but we all have a Plimsoll line. For a parent, it's that one extra time that we hear mommy or daddy, and boy, that was just the extra little bit that just landed. Or that question that comes from from spouse or child that we don't want to handle one more question. Or that coworker who comes into our office to ask us the same thing they asked us yesterday and the day before and the day before that. We all have that line. I mean, Moses might be a lot like us. I mean, going hard every day, making plans, getting things done, checking items off the list, but adding more things on the list. Moses is stressing out. He's burning the candle at both ends, and his wax is almost gone. And his father-in-law sees it on his first visit. You see, if you get overcommitted and overloaded, it can throw your balance off, especially when something else comes your way. And it doesn't have to be big. It could be anything. Like I said, that one extra mommy, that one extra daddy, that one extra, hey, do you got a minute? And that's just too much. You find yourself being knocked over and sunk by a storm that comes in your life, and you find yourself being knocked over or sunk by a wave that comes in your life. And how many of us, because of the tension in our life, have ended up blowing up on somebody that actually wasn't their fault? They were just the last one. The last one we encountered, and we explode. When I was little, I loved when my parents would bring me to Birmingham to the BJCC for the annual showing of the Ringling Brothers Barnum Bailey Combined Circus. I loved going to the circus. It was great. I mean, I grew up in Gadsden. We didn't really have the circus that came to town. Every now and then, Bubba and his two cats would show up at the Agricola Shopping Center parking lot. You know, it wasn't a big show. I enjoyed going to the circus. I liked watching all the acts. I loved it all. I loved the clowns and what they would do. I loved the acrobats, the high rope walkers. I loved every bit of it. But especially, I loved it when the center ring was transformed and out would walk Gunther Gable Williams, the lion tamer. He was dressed outlandishly, and he had his 3 pieces of equipment with him before he would enter the cage with the lions. He had a pistol on his hip. He had a whip in his hand. And he had the other item, the other tool of a lion tamer. He had a stool. A stool. And I'd watch him go into the cage with the lions, and he would crack that whip, and the lions would move, and he'd crack that whip, and they would come down and stand up on their hind legs and hop toward him. It was just amazing, the control, as he yelled things in foreign languages, and they just all seemed to understand, and I was captivated by this. And then there was always that one lion. Got up on the wrong side of the cage, not very happy, not really into this today, and is showing Gunther Gable Williams all the attitude he had. And I think in that moment, as the whip cracks and the lion just roars and seems to be getting closer toward him, I'm thinking, as a kid would, he's going to go for the pistol. I'm about to see something that a kid shouldn't see, but this is going to be memorable. But he never did. All those years, never saw Gunther Gable Williams shoot a single lion. But in that moment, he would reach for the stool. He'd pick it up and flip it and catch it by the seat, and he would point the 4 legs of that stool toward the lion, and he'd crack the whip. And he would yell, and he would jab that stool toward the lion. He'd crack the whip and yell, and keep jabbing the stool toward the lion over and over again. And before long, the lion would just stop. Would just go and get back on its little perch and wait. I was fascinated by that. A stool would change a lion. But see, the reason it worked was the stool has 4 legs. And a lion, by its very nature, it is naturally made to always be assessing its environment and its threats. Anything coming at it, it's always trying to determine which is the one that I need to attack first. Which is the one that causes me the most danger? Where do I need to put my attention? Where do I need to put my wrath or my teeth? And when four legs are coming at you and they're all the same and you can't tell the difference between them, it just would, for the lion, it would cause him to become very distracted because his attention would get very fragmented. He couldn't focus. I'm not sure about you, but how many times in my life I can admit it feels like 8 stools are coming at me at one time. All of them with 4 legs. All of them coming right at me. And it's hard to focus on which one I need to do and pay attention to the most and which one is the most critical because my attention gets fragmented and I just can't get it done. Even Moses, as great a man as he was, he couldn't do everything. I mean, Moses had to learn the lesson that one day he would be considered the great giver of the law. You remember, he comes down from the mountain with the 10 Commandments later. He's going to be remembered as the amazing leader who brought God's people out of the land of Egypt and back to the land of Israel, the land that had been given to Abraham. But he wasn't a superhero. He was a person with a lot of responsibilities. And he had a lot of people relying on him. And so Jethro gave him advice. He says basically, this isn't what you're supposed to spend your life on. This isn't your purpose. So what you need to do is you need to select some people that can help you. Put them in charge of this. Let some people be over 1,000 people, and maybe some over 100, and some over 50, and some over 10, and let them hear what the people need, and let them answer, and let them judge, and then they'll only bring the great matters to you. The rest of them they'll handle themselves. In other words, Jethro was telling Moses, get others involved so they can share the load. And so they can share the benefit. They can share the blessing. They can share and own the process. I mean, you remember that powerful life lesson? Delegate to others what others can do so you can focus on the things that only you can do. Share the work with others. Not only the burden, but also the blessing. And that's what Jethro was trying to get Moses to see. The reality is in our life, from the time of Moses to even today, is someone is going to set your schedule. You can either set your schedule, and you can determine what you're going to do under the leadership of God and the guidance of God, how you're going to live your life and how you're going to put things in the proper priority so that you can be faithful to God in all that you do, or someone else is going to set that schedule for you, and they probably aren't going to care about that. That schedule is going to be set based off of their needs. You see, God is wanting us to seek Him, to spend time with Him, to listen to Him. And when we do, God will help us grow to know what we need to do, what we're gifted to do, and what we need to let others do. You see, if we allow ourselves to be so stressed that our attention is so fragmented, then how are we going to be the disciples that Jesus calls us to be? If we allow everything to take the priority in our life that stresses us and goes high on that to-do list, how are we going to be the follower of Christ that we're called to be? How are we going to be the spouse or the parent or the friend that we're supposed to be if we allow ourselves to get so stressed and our attention so fragmented? I mean, when you look back at your life, whenever you have those moments and you look back, you realize that the most important things in life are your relationship with God and your family and your friends. But how many times do those make the to-do list? And how often do those just get simply shoved completely off the list and out of our mind? Because we just let it happen. Moses wouldn't have been able to accomplish all that God knew he could, all that God had called him to do, if he stayed bogged down and if he stayed overwhelmed by all those other things. And if we aren't careful, we can get just as bogged down in our lives as well. And we can miss out on what God's calling us to do. So Jethro, the father-in-law of Moses, he might not be the best known person in the Bible, but I think his advice that he gave to Moses in the wilderness is still pretty good advice in our stress-filled world and our stress-filled lives. What you're doing isn't good. You're going to wear yourself out. You're going to wear out the people that's with you. It's hard. You can't do it alone. And thanks be to God, we don't have to. So do only what you can do. And delegate the rest to others. And leave the results to God. So that our attention can stop being fragmented. So that we can stop being so overloaded that we feel like we're sinking. And so that we can begin to live the life that God has called each of us to live. Thanks be to God. Amen. This morning, our closing song is Faithful to the End. And I hope that you will think about Moses and Jethro and think about where in your life you feel like that stool is coming at you and your attention is fragmented, or where you have allowed all the really important things like God and family and friends to be shoved off your to-do list and replaced by things that don't matter nearly as much. Where have you allowed that to happen, and how can you start seeing that change even today? Let's stand and sing together.